They said she's too old to understand. That's what the junior partner whispered across the conference table, not realizing that my hearing has never failed me. Not in 81 years, not even after the strokes, not even after the long winter that took my husband and half my faith in people. I heard every word, and I remember how his voice bent slightly upward at the end of the sentence, the cowardly way young men sound when they're about to commit something small and shameful. I didn't lift my eyes from the document in front of me. I didn't need to. I could feel the air thicken, the shared discomfort in the room, the clatter of pens being set down, the subtle choreography of people pretending not to witness a humiliation. They thought they were discussing me, but really, they were rehearsing their own decay, the day when someone younger will decide they too are too old to understand. I am Teresa Alvarez, founding partner of Alvarez & Sons Law, though the & Sons part has begun to feel like a private joke between the walls and me. I started this firm 45 years ago in a rented room above a bakery that smelled perpetually of yeast and ambition. I was 36, recently widowed, and a woman lawyer in a city where that still turned heads. My first desk was a repurposed kitchen table. My first client was a seamstress who had been denied severance pay because she couldn't read the contract. I drafted her case by hand, in pencil, with her child asleep in my lap. When we won, she brought me a loaf of bread in gratitude, and I promised myself I would never forget what justice smells like: fresh, warm, fleeting. Now I sit in a glass tower that bears my name, though lately I've noticed that even the nameplate has changed its sheen. The letters have been polished, modernized, as if someone wanted to erase the texture of time. The new partners prefer brushed steel to brass. They call it rebranding. I call it bleaching. My son Daniel insists it's just progress, but I know the difference between progress and burial. I've seen enough contracts disguised as condolences to know when something is being quietly removed. That morning, they had called the meeting under the pretense of succession planning, a gentle phrase, as deceitful as it is courteous. I had dressed carefully, a navy suit, the one with real buttons, not the kind that pretend to be metal. I applied lipstick, a shade called Dignidad, because one must armor oneself with details. When I arrived, Daniel greeted me with a kiss that didn't touch his lips. He looked nervous, but practiced, like a man who had been rehearsing his lines in the mirror. The conference room smelled of antiseptic and ambition. My portrait hung on the far wall, smaller than I remembered, half hidden behind a new flat-screen monitor that flashed the firm's updated logo, Alvarez Group. Not & Sons, not even law, just group. A perfect word for erasure. They began with a presentation, charts, projections, buzzwords, all the corporate necromancy that makes people believe ethics can be quantified. Daniel spoke first, introducing the transition plan, and the others nodded like obedient jurors. I listened, my face neutral, while he explained how the firm must evolve beyond individual legacy. Individual legacy. I almost smiled. My entire career had been a fight for individual legacy, for women whose husbands had stolen their pensions, for nurses dismissed without benefits, for secretaries dismissed with a shrug. Now my own son spoke of legacy as an inconvenience, something to be streamlined. When he finally looked at me, it was with that patient, managerial tenderness people reserve for the elderly and the unstable. "We're not excluding you, Mama," he said. "We just want to make sure everything is secure for you, financially and legally. Evan has drawn up some documents for you to review." Evan, my former protege, the boy I taught to cross-examine without cruelty, to write without arrogance. I turned to him. His tie was too tight, his eyes darting. He slid a folder toward me as if feeding a dangerous animal. I opened it and saw the words, "Durable Power of Attorney." I read the first paragraph slowly, letting each phrase pierce. They were transferring all decision-making authority for the firm's assets to a managing board in the event of mental incapacity. My name appeared 3 times. Beneath it, my supposed signature, dated 2 months ago. I closed the folder and smoothed the edge with my palm. No one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked with courtroom precision. I looked at Daniel and said, very softly, "Where did you get this?" He blinked. "You signed it, Mama." "Don't you remember?" His tone was careful, like a man coaxing a wild thing. For a second, I almost doubted myself. Age has a way of hollowing your certainty. Every lapse in memory becomes a wound, waiting to be used against you. I tried to recall. Had I signed something? There had been so many papers lately. Insurance renewals, tax filings, pension transfers. I remembered a dinner at his house, a bottle of wine, his wife hovering in the background with that gentle pity that feels like chloroform, a pen, a stack of documents, my hand aching, my son saying, "It's just routine, Mama." The shame rose before the anger did, not shame at them, at me. I, who had once dismantled fraudulent contracts with surgical precision, had let my guard down for love. That is the final trap of motherhood. You teach your children to outgrow you, and then you're surprised when they do it with knives. I didn't speak again during the meeting. They mistook my silence for confusion. They began to talk over me, about me, around me, as if I had already dissolved into the wallpaper. Evan asked Daniel if they should loop her in later once the medical documentation was finalized. Medical documentation. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. I gathered my papers calmly, closed the folder, and stood up. "I'll review these," I said, alone. Daniel smiled with exaggerated patience. "Of course, Mama. Take your time." I looked at him and thought how strange it is that betrayal can wear the face you once kissed goodnight. I walked out of that room slower than usual, not because of my knees, but because I wanted them to think I was frail. Let them. There is power in being underestimated. It makes the blade of justice easier to conceal. In the corridor, the new receptionist glanced up from her phone and smiled too brightly, as if to reassure herself that I was harmless. I nodded and continued down the hall. The air smelled of disinfectant and false beginnings. In my office, the small one they'd moved me to for comfort, I closed the blinds and sat at the desk. I took the folder from my bag and laid it flat before me. My signature looked correct, every curve precise, but I knew the pressure of my own hand, and that ink wasn't mine. It had been traced, mechanically, using one of those stylus pads they keep for digital forms. I recognized the tremor of falsity instantly. Forgery has its own accent. I turned the pages slowly, reading every line as if dissecting a tumor. They had invoked cognitive decline as justification for oversight. There was no medical certificate attached, only an unsigned memo referencing recent behavioral concerns. I laughed out loud then, quietly, bitterly, behavioral concerns. I had shouted at an intern 2 weeks ago for misquoting a precedent. That was their evidence. Once upon a time, that fire had made me legendary. Now it made me suspect. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought of the bakery above which this firm was born, the smell of bread rising under the floorboards, the clatter of my first typewriter, the sound of victory in a courtroom that never expected it from a woman. I thought of the nights I came home too tired to eat, the files piled on the bed like silent companions. All that labor, all that devotion, condensed into a single dismissive sentence from a man who barely knew how to draft a trust. She's too old to understand. But I do understand. I understand that power, once given freely out of love, is the hardest to reclaim. I understand that my son has mistaken kindness for weakness, gratitude for surrender, and I understand that the law, my law, remembers better than sons do. The signatures, the clauses, the charters I wrote by hand before he could even spell equity. They will remember me, even if he tries to forget. Outside my window, the city was fading into dusk. Office lights blinked on one by one like small confessions. I reached for my pen, the same fountain pen I'd used in every major case, its nib slightly worn, its weight familiar. I drew a single line under my printed name on the final page of the forged document, not to sign, but to sever. Then I whispered to the empty room, too old to understand, perhaps, but not too old to remember. And that, I think, was the moment I stopped being their relic and became their reckoning. The next morning, the betrayal revealed itself, not in shouting or confrontation, but in the quiet click of an email notification. The subject line read, "Internal Governance Adjustments, effective immediately." I almost didn't open it. The firm sends out hundreds of such notices a month, most filled with procedural jargon and self-congratulations. But the sender's name caught my eye, Evan Sorensen. The boy who used to bring me coffee during his internship, who once asked for my advice on how to propose to his girlfriend, who had cried in my office after his first courtroom loss. I opened the email and read it twice. It was a formal statement announcing the restructuring of Alvarez Group's leadership under a newly ratified corporate trust, transferring operational control from individual shareholders to a managing board. My name appeared again, listed beneath a sterile phrase, founding member, emerita, advisory role. A role with no voting rights, no executive privileges, no voice. It was done, efficient as a scalpel. I sat for a moment, letting the screen's blue light flicker across my hands. I had seen hundreds of betrayals in my career, divorce settlements poisoned by greed, business partners suing each other into oblivion. But this one carried a different temperature. It was quiet, bloodless, familial, the kind of treachery that doesn't even raise its voice because it knows the victim won't. I scrolled to the attachments, scanned forms, notarized pages, board minutes from a meeting I had never attended, my own name recorded among those present by proxy. They had faked my attendance. They had done it all with the precision of lawyers who learned deceit not from the streets, but from conference rooms. For a few seconds, I considered calling Daniel. My finger hovered over the phone. I imagined his voice, soft and reasonable, the voice he used when he wanted to neutralize me. "Mama, it's just formalities," he would say. "Don't get upset. We're protecting you." Protecting me from what? My own mind? My competence? My existence? I placed the phone down slowly and reached for a legal pad. Old habits reassert themselves when betrayal hits. The instinct to document is stronger than anger. I began to list every irregularity I could think of: forged signature, unannounced board meeting, misrepresentation of capacity. Then I stopped, my pen trembling slightly. I realized that the very paper on which I wrote, branded with the firm's logo, belonged to them now, at least in their eyes. Even the stationery had been claimed. I left the office and went outside. The building's lobby was all glass and marble, echoing like an airport terminal. The receptionist greeted me with that professional brightness that smells faintly of pity. "Good morning, Ms. Alvarez," she said. "Ms., not Mrs. not partner. Titles shrink faster than skin. Outside, the air was too warm for autumn, heavy with exhaust and the metallic scent of rain that never comes. I walked slowly down the block, past the cafe where I used to meet clients who couldn't afford the firm's rates, past the flower shop where the owner still waved at me through the window. I waved back, pretending to be just another retiree on her morning stroll. I reached the courthouse steps before I realized where my feet had taken me. The building loomed gray and self-satisfied, a structure I had once walked into with the certainty of a priest entering a temple. I used to know every clerk by name, every judge by tone. Now I was just another old woman pausing to catch her breath. I sat on the marble railing and opened my bag. The forged documents were there, neatly folded, their weight disproportionate to their size. I reread the first paragraph again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the betrayal to solidify into fact. Denial is a luxury. Confirmation is strategy. Inside the courthouse lobby, I spotted a familiar face, Ruth Lerman, an old colleague who had retired 5 years earlier. She was walking slowly, leaning on a cane that looked too elegant to be practical. When she saw me, her expression flickered between delight and concern. "Teresa, my God, what brings you here?" she asked. I smiled thinly. "Habit." We sat on a bench beneath the portrait of a long-dead judge who had once told me women lawyers were a novelty act. Ruth peered at the papers in my lap. "Work still?" she said. "Always." I hesitated, then handed her the top sheet. She adjusted her glasses and scanned the text, her eyebrows knitting. "This is a transfer of authority," she murmured. "You agreed to this?" I shook my head. "Apparently." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes sharp behind the lenses. "Do you trust them?" "I used to," I said. "Then you already know the answer." Ruth told me about a paralegal she knew who'd left the firm last year, disillusioned by its new leadership. "If anyone can help you dig, it's her," Ruth said, scribbling a number on a napkin. "She's young, hungry, and hates bureaucracy, exactly the kind you need." I thanked her, folded the napkin, and slipped it into my wallet like a talisman. On my way out, I caught my reflection in the courthouse glass. Neat suit, steady posture, silver hair pulled tight. I looked every bit the relic they believed me to be, but I also looked unafraid. Back home, the apartment felt different. The silence wasn't restful, it was surgical. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, spreading the documents across the table like a crime scene. In a way, it was. Each page bore the fingerprints of a betrayal carried out under fluorescent lights, between polite smiles. I studied the signature again. There it was, the flaw. My full name written as Teresa A. Alvarez, without the accent on the second A. I never forget that accent. Not in 45 years of filings, not in 1,000 contracts, not once. It's the kind of detail men dismiss as sentimental, but details are what build cases. I dug through an old drawer until I found the founding charter of the firm, the original one typed on onion skin paper. The smell of it nearly made me weep. Dust, ink, and persistence. I read the clauses carefully until I reached Article 4, Section 2, the clause I had insisted on including, despite the young men's protests at the time. It stipulated that no transfer of ownership or governance could occur without unanimous consent of all founding members or their legal heirs. And in the absence of heirs, the founding member herself retained permanent veto power. I had forgotten that little line. Forgotten, but not erased. The clause was still valid, and the board's forgery invalidated their entire action. They had hung themselves with a rope I had woven decades earlier. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, but instead, I felt an ache that had nothing to do with victory. My son had either not read the charter or chosen to ignore it. Both possibilities wounded me. I wondered when exactly he had started seeing me not as a person but as a liability. I thought of him as a child, sitting on my office floor drawing on legal pads, saying he wanted to be just like Mama. Somewhere between then and now, admiration had calcified into resentment. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city hummed outside, restless as an argument left unresolved. I sat in the dark with a glass of wine and the charter in my lap. The wine was too sweet. I'd bought it on sale months ago, never intending to drink it alone. I turned on the desk lamp and began writing a letter, addressed not to Daniel, but to myself. I needed to see the facts in my own handwriting, to anchor reality before the gaslighting began. You are not losing your memory. You did not sign those papers. You know the law. They have made a mistake, and you will correct it. I wrote it over and over until the words steadied my hand. By morning, I had decided what to do. I called the number Ruth had given me. A young voice answered, brisk but kind. "This is Maya," she said. I introduced myself. There was a pause. "Wait, the Teresa Alvarez?" I almost laughed. "What's left of her?" I replied. I explained the situation briefly. She didn't interrupt, didn't condescend. "Bring everything," she said. "If it's forged, we'll find it." I arrived at her apartment that afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase older than she was. Her workspace was cluttered, but alive. Books, open laptops, a half-eaten sandwich on top of a stack of legal journals. She looked at the documents as if they were puzzles, not tragedies. "You see this?" she said, pointing to the metadata on the digital signature file. "The timestamp doesn't match the filing date. They backdated it. Amateur mistake." She grinned, a flash of mischief. "They forgot you taught me everything about evidence chain integrity in law school, indirectly anyway." For the first time in days, I smiled. When I left her apartment, dusk had settled over the city like a verdict. I walked slowly, the briefcase lighter now that the truth was shared. Yet beneath the relief was something heavier, a dawning understanding that there was no way back to the world I'd lived in before that email. Something had cracked permanently, a plate dropped from too high. My son, my protege, my firm, they had already crossed to a side I couldn't reach without burning the bridge completely. At home, I poured another glass of wine and stared at my reflection in the dark window. My face looked carved out of patience. I whispered to the empty room. So this is how they do it now, not with fire, but with forms. The city lights blinked like indifferent eyes. I turned away and began organizing my case files again, page by page. If they wanted to play law, I would give them law, not the glossy kind that lives in press releases, but the old kind, the sharp kind, the kind that remembers. By midnight, I had drafted a new document, Notice of Ownership Dispute and Demand for Internal Review. 3 pages, precise and elegant. I printed it, signed it with deliberate flourish, and slid it into an envelope addressed to the board. As I sealed it, I felt the old power in my hand, the one that had never really left. The betrayal had done something unexpected. It had woken the lawyer in me, the one who had slept too long under the weight of motherhood and sentiment. I looked at the clock. 12:01 a.m., a new day, and the first move was mine. The following weeks unfolded in that peculiar rhythm of false calm that always follows the first blow, the lull between deceit and discovery. No one at the firm mentioned my letter, no acknowledgement, no official response, but the silence itself was answer enough. They were circling, calculating, deciding whether I was a threat or merely an old woman rattling her chains. In the meantime, the small gestures of exclusion multiplied like hairline cracks in marble, nothing loud enough to protest, yet together forming a design meant to erase. My name disappeared from the morning memos. The receptionist no longer called me partner, only Ms. Alvarez, her tone heavy with the polite pity reserved for the displaced. Even my key card began to misbehave, sometimes denying me entry until someone from HR reactivated it. Each time it happened, I smiled, thanked them sweetly, and noted the date and time in my private notebook. Every indignity is a piece of evidence if you write it down carefully enough. Daniel, ever the strategist, called once a week to check in. His voice through the receiver was warm honey over broken glass. He spoke of my health, of the importance of rest, of how I deserved to enjoy the fruits of my labor after so many years of sacrifice. I listened, saying little, my eyes wandering over the shelves of law books I had read a dozen times and could quote even now, each paragraph like a pulse. I wondered if he had rehearsed these speeches, perhaps with his wife standing beside him, nodding approval, the two of them convinced that soft condescension was kinder than confrontation. When he paused, I would simply say, "Thank you, dear," in the same tone I used when he was 5 years old and brought me a crooked drawing, so proud of his work he didn't see it was upside down. I still went to the office, of course. They hadn't yet dared to forbid it. My new workspace was a small glass cubicle near the archives, a space that used to house interns. It smelled of dust and printer toner, and the fluorescent light flickered in a way that made the room feel like an interrogation cell. They called it a transitional office. I called it what it was, containment, but I used it well. Each morning, I arrived before anyone else, when the building still carried the quiet of sleep. I brought thermoses of coffee and worked through old files, the forgotten cases no one wanted to review, because history, like rot, accumulates in the corners people ignore. There, among the brittle pages and expired signatures, I began to see the map of what they had done. Evan had been thorough but careless. In his eagerness to impress Daniel, he had left digital fingerprints on everything. Emails confirming the board meeting, internal memos referencing maternal sensitivity, invoices from consultants hired to assess my capacity. The language was cautious, always wrapped in the silk of legality, but the intention was transparent. They had been planning the transition for months, long before the supposed conversation about succession. Each line was a quiet knife slipped between ribs. I printed everything, filing it neatly in a folder labeled estate planning, so ordinary that no one bothered to check. At lunch, I would sit alone in the cafeteria. Once, years ago, this room had been full of noise and camaraderie. Associates fought over case strategies. Assistants gossiped. Partners lingered over coffee. Now it buzzed with the faint hum of machines and muted politeness. They didn't know how to talk to me. To them, I was both legend and liability, the ghost of a legacy they wanted to modernize out of existence. Occasionally, a young associate would approach me with shy admiration, usually a woman, eyes bright with the reckless hunger of someone who still believed in justice. "Ms. Alvarez," she'd say, "is it true you once cross-examined a senator?" I'd smile and nod, offering a fragment of memory like a relic from a war no one studies anymore. I could see the conflict in their faces, admiration warring with fear. To be seen talking to me was to risk being labeled old school, which in the new vocabulary meant contagious. One afternoon, Evan visited my office. He stood at the doorway, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression a mask of professional concern. "Teresa," he began, deliberately avoiding the old title of Ms. Alvarez. "How are you feeling?" The question was a probe, not compassion. Alive, I replied, not looking up from my notes. He shifted, uncertain whether to interpret that as humor or threat. You know, Daniel's really worried. He thinks all this stress... I cut him off. The stress of being robbed, Evan. His mouth opened, then closed again. He tried to recover. No one's robbing you. We're just trying to secure your legacy. I looked at him then, really looked. The nervous eyes, the smirk rehearsed in a mirror. The boy who once stammered through his first deposition and now believed he could speak to me as if to a client in cognitive decline. Legacy, I said softly, isn't secured by theft. He started to respond, but I held up my hand, the one that once silenced courtrooms. Don't, I said. Every word you say will sound like an apology wrapped in an excuse. And I'm too old to be soothed. He flushed, murmured something about misunderstanding, and left. When the door closed, I allowed myself a moment of tremor, not fear, just recognition of how far I had fallen in their estimation. Once, I was the voice that determined futures. Now, they spoke to me like a liability to be managed. That realization, oddly, steadied me. The worst had already happened. Now, there was only work to do. Days blurred into one another. I began to notice the building's sounds in a new way. The hiss of the elevator cables, the rhythmic click of heels on marble, the murmur of voices behind closed doors. Sound carries secrets if you know how to listen. Once, in the corridor, I overheard two associates discussing the upcoming rebranding launch. One said, "The new logo's ready. The founders will love it." The other laughed. "There's only one founder left, and she doesn't even know what's coming." They didn't see me standing a few feet away. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. Let them think I was invisible. It's easier to strike when no one's watching. At home, the loneliness pressed closer. Friends had thinned out over the years. The few who remained were scattered across states, nursing their own invisibilities. I cooked less, ate standing up, the television muttering in the background like a ghost. Sometimes I caught myself rehearsing conversations with Daniel, imagining him as he was at 16, argumentative, brilliant, still capable of awe. I wanted to ask him when ambition had turned him hollow, but there's no court in which that question can be tried. One evening, I received a message from Maya, the young paralegal Ruth had connected me with. She had found more. The timestamp mismatch she'd mentioned earlier wasn't isolated. Several documents in the transfer file bore sequential digital IDs, all created within the same 2-hour window. They backdated everything, she said. We can prove it easily if you want to take this to court. I thanked her, but asked her to hold the information for now. A lawsuit would make it public, and I wasn't ready to let them turn my life into spectacle. This had to be handled internally, methodically. They built their power through appearances. I would dismantle it through paperwork. By the end of the month, Daniel invited me to dinner. His tone on the phone was bright, almost desperate. Just a family night, Mama. No firm talk, I promise. I agreed, curious to see what performance awaited. His house was a cathedral of new money, glass, chrome, white furniture you couldn't sit on without apologizing. His wife, Lila, greeted me with that thin kindness women use when they want to prove civility while resenting the intrusion. The meal was meticulous, each course plated like a negotiation. Daniel spoke of grandchildren I rarely saw, of his plans for expansion, of how proud he was of our legacy. I listened, tasting bitterness in the wine. Finally, as coffee was served, he leaned forward and said casually, "Mama, you don't have to keep going to the office every day. People talk. They think it's unhealthy." Unhealthy. That word landed heavier than any insult. "Do they?" I said. "And what do you think, Daniel?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I think you've done enough. You've earned peace. Let us handle things now." I looked at him, this man I had raised, his face a refined echo of my own. "Peace," I said slowly, "is not something given, Daniel. It's something kept." He sighed, reached for my hand like a man touching an unexploded device. "Please, Mama, don't make this harder than it has to be." I withdrew my hand. "You already have." When I left that evening, the sky was the color of old paper. Driving home, I felt strangely calm. His attempt at kindness had sealed what his betrayal had only begun. There was no going back, no middle ground between obedience and dignity. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the car window. Tired, yes, but sharp-eyed, alert. Age hadn't dulled me. It had stripped away vanity. They thought I was declining, but really, I was distilling. The next morning, I returned to the office early and unlocked the archives. I found the original partnership agreement, scanned it, and uploaded it to a private drive. Then I began drafting memoranda to the board, each one requesting clarifications about procedural irregularities, each phrased in perfect, measured legalese. They would have to answer, and every answer would corner them further. It wasn't revenge I sought. It was recognition. I didn't want to destroy the firm. I wanted them to remember who built it. By the end of that week, the first signs of panic appeared. My email access was suddenly restricted due to a technical update. My desk phone stopped receiving calls. HR scheduled a wellness consultation for me with a doctor whose specialty, I discovered, was geriatric psychology. The message was clear. They were preparing to declare me incompetent. I laughed aloud, the sound startling even to me. So this was their strategy: pathologize dissent, turn resistance into illness. I canceled the appointment and sent a firm reply. I do not require evaluation. I require accountability. That evening, as I left the office, I paused in the lobby beneath the glowing new logo, Alvarez Group, my name without my meaning. I reached out and touched the cold metal letters. The surface was smooth, unmarked, without fingerprint. It looked permanent, but I knew better. Nothing built on deceit lasts. I whispered to the empty air, "You took my name. Let's see if you can keep it." Then I walked into the night, steady, deliberate, invisible in the way predators are before they strike. The shift began quietly, the way seasons change before anyone names them. One morning I woke earlier than usual, the sky still half dark, the city caught in that gray hour when even ambition sleeps. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the stack of papers I had been collecting for weeks. Emails, meeting notes, scanned contracts, all arranged like the bones of something that had once been alive. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger. What I felt was precision. It had taken me most of a lifetime to understand that fury clouds judgment, but clarity sharpens it. The betrayal had done its work. It had burned away the sentimental fog that had blurred my sight. Now there was only the work of dismantling the illusion that they could erase me. I began the day by calling an old contact, Lucinda Vargas, a notary who owed me several favors and who had never trusted the new management at the firm. Her voice on the phone was as gravelly as ever, the voice of a woman who'd smoked through 40 years of secrets. When I told her what I needed, she whistled softly. "That's dangerous, Teresa," she said. "You're poking at men who think paperwork is religion." I smiled. "Then I suppose it's time for a reformation." She laughed, a low, approving sound, and agreed to meet me that afternoon. Before hanging up, she said, bring everything. And bring the old pen if you still have it. We'll do this properly. At the office, the day passed in a haze of civility that bordered on parody. Evan passed my glass cubicle twice, pretending to be deep in conversation with a junior associate. Daniel was nowhere to be seen, but I recognized his handwriting on a memo that arrived in my inbox, an announcement of a mandatory compliance workshop for all partners, focusing on mental fitness and ethical transparency. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. They were still trying to build their case for my removal, laying the groundwork under the guise of corporate wellness. I attended anyway. If you want to understand an enemy, listen to how they justify themselves. The workshop took place in the largest conference room, its walls lined with framed photos of the firm's early days. My own face stared down at me from one of them, a younger version of myself, confident, unblinking. The presenter was a cheerful consultant who spoke in the vocabulary of management therapy, mindfulness, synergy, emotional intelligence. Around me, the partners nodded like parishioners pretending faith. When she asked us to share one area of vulnerability in our professional lives, I raised my hand. My vulnerability, I said evenly, is forgiveness. The room fell silent for a heartbeat too long. Then the consultant smiled uncertainly and scribbled something on her clipboard. Evan coughed into his fist. I didn't elaborate. Some truths need only to be spoken once. That afternoon, I met Lucinda in a cafe near the river. She arrived in a heavy coat that smelled faintly of tobacco and mint, her gray hair pinned in the same loose bun she'd worn since the 80s. We took a corner booth away from the windows. I handed her the copies of the documents and the original partnership charter. She read in silence for nearly 20 minutes, her pen tapping against the edge of the table. Finally, she said, "You've got them, Teresa. They used your name to authorize a trust that's legally void under your own founding clause. The signatures can't stand." I nodded. "Can we certify that?" She smiled. "Of course. We'll timestamp the originals, notarize your statement, and archive the metadata off-site. They'll never see it coming." I felt an unexpected tremor then, not of fear, but of something resembling grief. I hadn't realized until that moment that I was truly going to fight. It wasn't just about the firm anymore. It was about the slow, deliberate theft of dignity that so many women of my generation endured at the hands of those they raised, taught, or loved. Every file on that table was a testament not only to my competence but to theirs, because they had learned their ruthlessness from me. I was their blueprint, and now I was their obstacle. Lucinda signed the final page and slid it back across the table. "This will hold up in any court," she said. "But you're not going to court, are you?" I shook my head. "No, I don't want spectacle. I want surrender." She looked at me closely, her eyes softening. "You're a colder woman than I remember." I smiled faintly. "No, just clearer." That evening, as I returned home, I stopped at a small bookstore near my apartment. I used to pass it every week and never enter, always telling myself I was too busy. Now I stepped inside. The air smelled of paper and rain. I bought a new journal, hardcover, thick pages, the kind that demands seriousness. When I came home, I wrote on the first page, "Phase 2 begins." The words looked almost clinical, but beneath them pulsed something alive. The next day, I began to act differently. I no longer arrived early to the office. I came exactly on time, unhurried, composed, greeting everyone with a civility that unnerved them more than hostility could. I dressed sharply again, not for vanity but for theater. Dark suits, the silk scarf I used to wear in court, subtle perfume that lingered just long enough to remind them I wasn't a ghost. People began to whisper, "She looks different," I overheard one intern say. "Sharper, like she knows something." I did. I started requesting meetings, innocuous at first, updates on ongoing cases, budget reports, client lists. Every request was phrased as curiosity, but each document contained another thread of proof. By the end of the week, my private folder had grown thick enough to choke them if I chose to drop it on the board table. Yet I didn't act. Not yet. Strategy requires patience. Timing is half of power. It was during one of those days that I encountered Maya again. She appeared in my office doorway, holding a flash drive. "I found the original digital transfer," she said. "You were right. They backdated the entire chain, and the witness signature belongs to someone who doesn't exist in the bar registry." I took the drive, my fingers brushing hers. "Good work," I said. She hesitated, then added, "You know, they think you're fading. They talk about you like you're a figure in a museum." I looked at her and smiled. "That's what makes museums dangerous, Maya. They hold artifacts that outlive empires." She grinned, young and unbroken. "Then let's make them remember who built this one." That night I couldn't sleep again, but the restlessness was different now. It wasn't anxiety, it was momentum. I sat by the window, watching the lights of the city move in slow rhythm. I thought of the first days of the firm, the long nights, the smell of cheap coffee, the thrill of winning cases that no one believed a woman could win. I remembered the promises I made to myself, to never let power corrupt me, to never become the people I fought against. Somewhere along the way, I had allowed comfort to dull vigilance. Now the fire had returned, tempered by experience. The next morning, Daniel called me to his office. He wanted to clear the air, as he put it. His tone was almost apologetic, which immediately made me wary. When I entered, he stood by the window, looking out at the skyline like a man trying to summon gravitas. "Mama," he began, "I think we've misunderstood each other. The board's nervous and you've been distant." I sat, folding my hands on my lap. "I'm listening." He turned, wearing the expression of someone practicing empathy. "No one wants conflict. You've earned our respect, but the firm has to modernize. Investors expect stability." I raised an eyebrow. "And by stability, you mean silence." He winced. "You're twisting my words." "No," I said softly. "I'm translating them." He sighed, walking toward the desk. "Please, Mama, we can make this easy. Let us handle operations. You'll keep your name, your office, your stipend. Everyone wins." It was almost touching, the way he tried to package betrayal as mercy. I stood slowly. "Do you remember what I told you when you first joined the firm?" He frowned, searching his memory. "That law is about truth?" "No," I said. "That law is about endurance. The truth changes depending on who can afford to speak it. Endurance, however, cannot be bought." He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. "You'll get the paperwork soon, Daniel. Read it carefully. You might finally understand the law you thought you owned." I left before he could answer. In the hallway, I passed Evan, who gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I returned it with one that did. Back in my office, I drafted the notice, Request for Emergency Audit and Ownership Verification. The title alone would send shivers through the boardroom. I attached the notarized statement from Lucinda, the metadata reports from Maya, and the clause from the original charter. When I finished, I printed a single copy, placed it in an envelope embossed with the firm's crest, and wrote on it in careful script, "To be opened in the presence of all partners." I didn't send it yet. I wanted them to stew in their confidence a little longer. That evening, I walked home through the park. The air was cold enough to bite, but clean, free of the recycled air of offices. Children played on swings. Dogs barked. A street musician played a slow, melancholy tune on a saxophone. I stopped to listen. There was something cleansing about standing in the open, surrounded by lives that had nothing to do with power. For the first time in months, I took a deep breath and felt my lungs expand without effort. Maybe this was what freedom tasted like. Not revenge, not victory, just the ability to breathe without permission. At home, I poured myself a small glass of brandy, the good kind I'd been saving for years. I raised it to the air and whispered, "To clarity." The glass caught the light, a brief spark in the dim room. I realized that whatever happened next, the outcome no longer mattered as much as the act of reclaiming myself. The midpoint of every story is a choice, and I had made mine. I would not die a legend in a plaque on a wall. I would live long enough to dismantle the myth they built around me. As I set the glass down, my phone buzzed, a message from Maya. They're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow. No agenda listed. I smiled. The timing was perfect. I closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness settle like a curtain before the final act. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m, which amused me, because men who believe they own the day like to begin their battles early, as if the hour itself could intimidate opposition into compliance. I arrived at 8:45, not a minute sooner, walking through the revolving doors in a navy suit that fit a body they had already written off, my hair pinned neatly, my old leather briefcase in my hand, like a relic returned from exile. The receptionist's greeting faltered on her lips for a moment. She'd been told things. I could see it in the way her eyes skipped over my face to the visitor log, as if I might need a badge in a building whose foundation I had personally guaranteed. I signed my name without comment, rode the elevator with 2 junior associates who lowered their voices mid-sentence when they realized I was standing between them, and walked into the corridor outside the main conference room to find the door, already closed. That was my first answer. They had begun without me. I waited. I did not knock. Let them feel the illusion of privacy for a moment longer. At 8:59, I pushed the door open and stepped in. The table was full. Partners arranged along the sleek surface like a panel of jurors who had forgotten the defendant could speak. Daniel at the head in a too crisp suit, Evan on his right, an unfamiliar man in a charcoal suit on his left, clearly. Outside counsel brought in to give a professional shape to their cowardice. My chair, the one that had been mine for decades, was occupied by a woman I did not know. She half rose, flustered. I let my eyes travel the length of the room, took in the new logo on the digital screen, the neat stack of folders before each seat, the way no one quite met my gaze head on. I walked to my old place without haste, placed my briefcase on the table, and the woman moved aside instinctively, mumbling an apology. I sat. "Good morning," I said. It was quiet, but the sound carried. They all heard it. Daniel cleared his throat and launched into his script. He spoke of recent tensions, of misaligned expectations, of the firm's duty to ensure continuity and stability in leadership. It was a speech written by committee, polished to remove any confession. The stranger in the charcoal suit was introduced as an independent legal advisor, there to help everyone navigate the complexities of succession. I watched his hands as he talked, soft hands, unscarred by real fights, the hands of a man who lived on billable hours and stainless abstractions. When they finally allowed the silence that signals a pivot, he folded his fingers and turned to me with a professional, almost sympathetic expression. "Ms. Alvarez," he began, "we all have enormous respect for your contributions, but there have been concerns raised about your well-being and your ability to fully engage with the firm's complex operations. In light of that, certain documents were prepared to protect both you and the organization. Our goal is collaboration, not confrontation. I let him finish, because interruption is a weapon best used sparingly. Then I asked, "Which documents?" He slid a folder toward me, as if offering medicine to someone too frail to hold it. Inside were printed copies of the same forged power of attorney, the same transfer of authority, now accompanied by a draft petition for the appointment of a guardian ad litem, my son. It was all there in black and white, their plan not only to mute me within the firm, but to legally dress it as compassion. I felt something inside me still, like a lake suddenly frozen over. Daniel spoke before I could. He leaned toward me, eyes too bright. "Mama, this isn't an attack. Please understand, everyone's under pressure. Clients need reassurance. If you just sign the confirmation, nothing needs to get ugly. You'll keep your stipend, your name on the masthead, your office. You won't have to worry about all this complicated nonsense anymore." Around us, the other partners held their breath, the way people do when they are watching someone be pushed toward a cliff and hope she jumps without forcing them to see the drop. The outside attorney slid a pen in my direction. "Take your time," he said. "But do know we've consulted medical professionals about age-related cognitive risks, and the consensus is that proactive measures are in your best interest." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the arrogance of calling theft a proactive measure. I did not touch the pen. I let the moment stretch, watched discomfort creep into their shoulders, saw Evan adjust his cufflinks, saw a young female partner I barely knew frown slightly, just enough to make me think she hadn't entirely sold her conscience yet. I closed the folder with care and rested both hands on it. "You filed fraudulent documents," I said evenly. "You misrepresented my capacity, falsified my presence at meetings, and attempted to strip a founding partner of her legal rights using instruments you barely understand. And now you invite me to approve your crime retroactively as an act of love." Evan exhaled sharply. Daniel's jaw tightened. The outside counsel began to speak, but I held up a hand. "Don't," I told him. "I have eaten men like you in open court." A murmur ran through the room, an exhale of collective unease. Daniel tried again, his voice rising a notch. "This is exactly what we were worried about, Mama. The paranoia, the dramatization. Nobody is committing a crime. We're just trying to simplify governance. You're overreacting." There it was, the familiar pivot, turn resistance into instability, call clarity delusion. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I pressed it down, because anger is their narrative for me, and I refused to hand it to them. "I brought something as well," I said. I opened my briefcase and took out the sealed envelope embossed with the firm's crest, the one Lucinda had notarized, the one containing every damning thread neatly stitched together. I placed it in the center of the table. "This is a notarized record of your actions, including metadata analysis from your own filing systems, along with a certified copy of the original charter that invalidates your little trust arrangement. It is to be opened with all partners present, which, as I see, they are." I leaned back. "Go ahead." No one moved. The outside counsel looked to Daniel. Daniel looked to Evan. Evan shifted his gaze to the young partner nearest him, who had the misfortune of sitting closest to the envelope. She swallowed and reached for it, her fingers trembling just enough that I almost pitied her, because she was about to witness the anatomy of her mentor's cowardice. She broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and began to read. With each paragraph, her expression changed, from confusion to surprise to something approaching fear. She passed it to the partner beside her, who went just as pale. The pages made their slow, inevitable circuit around the table. No one spoke. When they returned to Daniel, he didn't read them right away. He stared at me instead, searching my face for some softness, some maternal corner he could still exploit. I offered him none. Finally he read, and as his eyes moved down the page, his posture deflated. His calculation, I could tell, was immediate. If I took this outside, if I filed complaints with the bar, if I leaked it to the press, their bright, modern Alvarez group would glow for all the wrong reasons. The outside counsel cleared his throat. "These claims are serious," he said. "If accurate, they suggest irregularities that could expose the firm to liability." It was the gentlest way he could phrase the reality that they had tripped over their own hubris. Evan finally spoke. "We can explain some of this data," he began, but his voice lacked conviction. I watched his mask slip, the boy inside the suit remembering who taught him that manipulation of process is still subject to proof. "There won't be explanations," I said. "There will be corrections." The escalation did not end in that room. It began there. They did not apologize. Men like that rarely do. Instead, they pivoted to a more desperate strategy. If they could not quietly sign my authority away, they would try to break me emotionally. Over the next days, a wave of pressure rolled in, not from the board, but from the person they assumed would be my soft underbelly, my son. Daniel called constantly, at first with the same soothing tone, then with irritation, then with anger, the mask crumbling call by call. He accused me of overreacting, of sabotaging his reputation, of endangering the livelihoods of hundreds of employees who depend on stability. He said the words, "After everything I've done for this firm," and I nearly choked on the irony. When guilt didn't work, he reached for sentiment. "Do you really want our last years together to be like this, Mama?" he asked late one evening, his voice low and rehearsed. "Do you want us in court opposite each other?" I answered honestly. "I don't want that, but I will accept it." The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a man realizing that the thing he counted on, my fear of losing him, no longer outweighed my fear of losing myself. Then came the visit. He appeared at my apartment unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, the way he hadn't done in years, standing at my door with a bakery bag in his hands, like some ghost of younger days. I let him in. The apartment was tidy, plain, honest in a way his house never was. He put the bag on the table, took in the stacks of documents, the open notebook, the visible evidence that I was not drifting into oblivion, but preparing for war. "You're making this bigger than it has to be," he said, dropping the warm filial facade. "You're going to ruin me." It was the first true sentence he'd spoken in weeks. I looked at him, at the fine lines across his forehead, the weariness at the edges of his arrogance. "I warned you," I said. "You tried to take my mind on paper. Did you think I would thank you?" He began pacing, hands cutting the air. "I was trying to protect the firm, protect you. Investors get nervous when they hear the founder is 81 and still insists on signing off on major decisions. People talk about risk, about competency. This is how it's done now. You think you're the only one?" There it was, the confession dressed as justification. I let him speak himself into a corner, then said quietly, "You used my love as a legal strategy, Daniel. You brought me papers after dinner, smiling, telling me they were routine. You depended on my trust more than any clause. That is what you broke. Not the charter. Me." For a moment, I saw something fracture behind his eyes. Not remorse exactly, but recognition. He reached for my hand, and I didn't move mine away, but I also didn't close the distance. "If you go through with this," he whispered, "if you drag this out, we both lose." I shook my head. "You still think this is about winning. I am too old to care about that. I care about truth on record." He stepped back like I had slapped him. "Fine," he said. "Then don't blame me for what happens next." When he left, the apartment felt airless, but I opened all the windows, as if clearing the smell of something spoiled. Their next move was uglier, because fear had entered the equation. HR summoned me, not by email this time, but by couriered letter marked confidential. The meeting, they said, would address concerns staff had raised regarding interpersonal interactions and potential emotional distress. Language like that is a blade aimed at a woman's credibility. They wanted a record that I was difficult, volatile, intimidating. I almost smiled. I had been all those things for 50 years, and they'd called it leadership. In the small, sterile HR office, a young woman with a tablet asked me if I felt overwhelmed by changes, if I had someone to talk to, if I ever experienced confusion about dates or places. I answered each question calmly, thoroughly, using dates, case names, and statutory citations. I could see her discomfort grow with each precise memory. She had expected fragility. She got deposition-grade testimony. At the end, she clicked her pen anxiously and said, "We just want to make sure you feel supported." I replied, "If I felt supported, we wouldn't be here." Meanwhile, Maya informed me that some documents she used to access had been restricted and that Evan had questioned her about any unofficial assistance she might be providing. "They know I'm helping you," she said, not frightened, just annoyed. "If they fire you, I'll hire you," I told her. "We'll open a rival firm on the sidewalk if we have to." She laughed. The levity helped, but it also underscored how far things had gone. The escalation was no longer theoretical. They were trying to flush my allies, isolate me, push me into a corner where they could declare any resistance a symptom. I felt the strain in my body. One evening, alone in my kitchen, my hand trembled so hard the tea spilled. Not from age, that tremor had a different signature, but from the cumulative weight of having to justify my own sanity to people I had trained. I sat down, breathed slowly, pressed my palms flat on the table until the shaking eased. I thought of calling someone, but there was no one appropriate to call. Friends my age were tired of hearing about law. Younger women were drowning in their own battles. So I did what I have always done. I turned the feeling into work. I wrote another statement, this one not for courts or boards, but for myself. I described each maneuver they'd used: infantilization, procedural ambush, faux empathy, reputational threats, and I underlined a single sentence. They are counting on my fear of losing family to make me surrender my right to myself. Naming it made it weaker. The final spark in this escalation came from an unexpected direction. A regional business blog published a glowing profile of Alvarez Group's New Generation Leadership, featuring a photograph of Daniel and Evan standing in front of the building, my name gleaming above them. The article praised their modernization efforts, their bold governance reforms, and mentioned, almost casually, that the legendary founder has gracefully stepped back due to age-related limitations. I read that line 3 times, feeling each word settle like sediment. Gracefully stepped back. Age-related limitations. No one had asked me for a quote. No one had even told me the article was coming. It was not just an internal narrative now. It was public record. They were rewriting my story in real time, confident that I wouldn't know how to answer. But I did. I printed the article, highlighted the sentence, and added it to my growing folder, not as outrage, but as evidence of pattern. Then I called Lucinda. "It's time," I said. "Prepare the letters." We drafted notices to the board invoking the audit clause. We prepared in sealed envelopes complaints that could be filed with the bar if necessary. I didn't send them yet, but I made sure they existed, tangible, dated, ready. The knowledge of their existence was its own weapon. I carried that knowledge in my chest like a second heartbeat. In those days, the past pressed closer, not the sentimental kind with lullabies and school plays, but the harsher memories I had long buried to keep loving my son. The way he'd flinched at my reputation among his friends, the girlfriends who found me intimidating. The time he'd asked me not to speak at his college event because people already know you're impressive, Mama. It's too much. Little cuts, dismissed at the time as youthful discomfort, now reassembled into a mosaic that spelled out something simple and unsparing. He had been preparing to shrink me for a very long time. The betrayal at the firm was only its legal expression. Recognizing that did not make me hate him. Hatred is too consuming, and I don't donate that kind of energy. It made me withdraw something else instead. Excuses. So the pressure mounted. Professional smears and soft language, emotional appeals knotted with threats, institutional procedures deployed as weapons. Each move meant to corner me also sharpened me, forced me to locate the line where my fear of losing him met my duty to myself, and to step, finally, to the side of the ladder. By the time they demanded that I attend one more clarifying session with outside counsel, I realized this second wave of attack had done me an unintended kindness. They had stripped away the last illusion that this was a misunderstanding between reasonable people. It was not. It was a test of whether an old woman would accept being turned into a decorative story while still alive. I walked into that next meeting no longer hoping to be understood or forgiven, but ready to do the one thing I had spent my life doing for others and had almost forgotten I could do for myself: defend, thoroughly and without apology. The day of reckoning began without ceremony. The morning sky was dull, the kind of gray that makes even glass towers look tired, as if the city itself were withholding its approval of what was about to unfold. I dressed deliberately, choosing the dark charcoal suit I used to wear for closing arguments, the one that still carried the faint scent of cedar and adrenaline. My movements were calm, but my thoughts were exacting. The board had called yet another clarifying session to resolve outstanding governance concerns. I knew what that meant: one last attempt to coerce, confuse, or contain me before I could act. What they didn't know was that I was not coming as a subject of evaluation. I was coming as their judge. When I entered the building, the air felt different, brittle, as if the walls themselves anticipated noise. I walked past the receptionist, who greeted me with that overly bright politeness reserved for funerals and lawsuits. She didn't know which one this would be. The elevator doors closed around me, sealing me into a moment of quiet reflection, the kind I used to crave before stepping into courtrooms. I stared at my reflection in the metal panel, the faint distortions of my face making me look almost unfamiliar, sharper, older, truer. I thought of the years I had built this place, of the countless nights drafting contracts and arguments that shaped more than cases. They shaped lives. And I thought of the absurdity that now I had to defend my right to still exist in the house I built. The conference room was already full when I arrived. Daniel stood by the projector, surrounded by the same faces that had once treated me with deference, and now looked at me with a mix of embarrassment and unease. Evan sat 2 seats away, his posture stiff, his fingers tapping against a closed laptop like a man marking time before a verdict. There was also another new figure at the end of the table, a woman this time, sleek suit, crisp diction, the firm's latest outside consultant, presumably brought in to finish what the men had failed to accomplish. She greeted me with professional warmth and gestured to an empty seat. "We appreciate you joining us, Miss Alvarez. We just want to clear a few things up." I took my time removing my gloves and setting down my briefcase before answering. "Yes," I said. "So do I." I sat, crossing my legs, the way I used to when opposing counsel underestimated me. The consultant began her presentation, speaking in that careful tone used for dangerous animals and senior partners, something between respect and fear. She talked about governance, fiduciary responsibility, reputation management. Her words blurred into the monotone hum of bureaucratic defense. I waited until she reached the phrase, finalizing the transition plan, and then I spoke, my voice quiet but cutting. "There will be no transition." The room froze. Daniel's head jerked up. "Mama," he began, but I held up a hand, the gesture that used to stop entire courtrooms. "No, Daniel, you've had your say. You've had months of saying. Now you'll listen." I turned to the consultant. "You can stay if you like. It may be educational." Then I opened my briefcase and laid out 3 folders, each one thick, tabbed, and numbered. "These," I said, "are certified copies of the firm's founding charter, notarized records of the fraudulent filings you attempted to pass as legitimate, and evidence of procedural misconduct in the transfer of assets. I've already submitted sealed copies to the regulatory board and to my attorney, who is, ironically enough, a former protege of mine who still remembers the meaning of the word integrity. So, whatever you say here today will merely serve as your own exhibit." Evan's composure cracked first. "You can't," he started, but his voice faltered. I cut him off. "Can't what? Know the law? Invoke my own charter? Use the system I created?" I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "You've confused kindness for ignorance, Evan. It's a rookie mistake." His face flushed, and he glanced toward Daniel for rescue, but Daniel was staring at the folders as if they might bite. "This isn't necessary," my son said finally. "We can fix this quietly." I smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. "Quietly is how you stole from me, Daniel. Quietly is how men erase women. I am done with quiet." The consultant cleared her throat, attempting to reclaim control. "Ms. Alvarez, with respect, these are internal matters. Taking them outside the firm would damage your own reputation as well." I turned to her. "My reputation is built on truth, not comfort. If it can't survive honesty, it deserves to burn." She looked away. I opened the top folder and began reading aloud from the charter, each clause precise, the language old-fashioned yet unassailable. Article 4, Section 2. Any transfer of ownership or governance authority shall require the explicit written consent of the founding partner, whose signature cannot be substituted, delegated, or presumed. Do you see that word, Daniel? Cannot. Not may not, cannot. You built your theft on a grammatical impossibility. The silence that followed was dense, a soundless implosion of authority. Then Daniel said quietly, "You'd ruin everything over a few words?" I met his eyes. "Those few words are the foundation of the empire you enjoy. Without them, you're just another thief in a tailored suit." He swallowed hard, and for a moment, the boy he once was flickered through. The boy who used to sit in my office, drawing on my legal pads, saying he wanted to be brave like Mama. I almost softened, but then I remembered the forged signature, the smugness in that first meeting when he thought I was too old to understand. Compassion is a gift. Forgiveness is a privilege. He had earned neither. Evan tried to recover the narrative. Even if that clause stands, he said, his voice trembling with restrained panic, the board can still vote to remove you as a partner on the basis of incapacity. I nodded slowly, as if considering, then reached into the second folder and pulled out a thin sheaf of papers. These, I said, are affidavits from 2 licensed medical professionals confirming I am in full cognitive and legal capacity. Both were conducted independently, both recent. I anticipated your next move. That's the thing about experience. It tends to run a few steps ahead of ambition. The consultant sat back, lips pursed. Daniel was no longer hiding his anger. You planned this, he said. You set us up. I laughed softly. Daniel, my darling boy, you set yourselves up. You tried to stage a coup against a lawyer who spent her entire life anticipating coups. You used the law against the woman who wrote your first contract. Did you think betrayal sharpens only the young? He looked at me then with something raw in his face, anger, shame, disbelief, perhaps even a twisted form of admiration. What do you want? He asked finally. Name it. The question sounded almost like surrender, but I knew better. Men like him only barter when cornered. What I want, I said, is what was always mine, the firm, its integrity, and my peace. You'll sign a statement of correction acknowledging the illegitimacy of the prior transfer and reinstating me as senior counsel with full authority. You will resign from your position as managing partner, effective immediately. Evan will do the same. In exchange, I will not pursue formal disbarment proceedings. That's as generous as I'll ever be. A few gasps rippled through the room. Evan muttered something obscene under his breath, but Daniel remained silent. I could see the storm behind his eyes, the calculation of loss versus survival. Finally, he said, and if I refuse? I stood, gathering my folders with deliberate grace. Then you'll discover that the woman you dismissed as too old to understand still understands how to destroy a reputation with one phone call. Choose carefully. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, Daniel spoke again, softer now. You'd really do that to me? Your own son? I stopped, my hand on the door frame, and looked back. No, Daniel, you did it to yourself. I'm just signing the verdict. I walked out, the echo of my heels following me down the corridor like a gavel striking wood. Outside, the air felt sharp, almost celebratory. I didn't go straight home. I went to the small plaza across from the courthouse, the one where I used to eat sandwiches with young associates between hearings. I sat on a bench and watched the traffic move in its usual oblivious rhythm. For the first time in months, I felt the strange stillness that follows decisive action, not relief exactly, but the solemnity of completion. Whatever came next would come. I had already reclaimed what mattered most, my agency. Later that evening, I received an email from the board secretary. It was brief, emotionless, written in the language of surrender disguised as professionalism. Following today's meeting, the board acknowledges the procedural errors in prior filings and accepts your reinstatement under the terms discussed. The resignations of Daniel Alvarez and Evan Sorensen will be effective immediately. I stared at the words for a long moment, then closed the message without replying. There was nothing left to say. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city lights shimmered across the glass like confessions. My hands were steady now. I thought about power, not as possession, but as endurance. I thought about all the women who had sat in rooms full of men explaining their own worth back to them, waiting for permission that never came. I thought about my mother, who scrubbed offices for lawyers like me and never once imagined her daughter would own a law firm. I thought about the young associates still in that building, watching everything, learning from every silence and every defiance. Maybe, I thought, this was never about legacy in the way they imagined. Maybe it was about teaching the next woman that you can be underestimated and still be unstoppable. I picked up the phone and called Maya. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," I said. There was a pause, then laughter, rich and incredulous. "You actually did it?" "No," I said. I reminded them who did. We spoke for a while about logistics, about the transfer of records, about rebuilding the firm under new terms. When I hung up, I felt neither triumph nor vengeance, only a quiet, resolute fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying a long fight to its rightful end. Before going to bed, I walked to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept my old fountain pen, the same one I had used when the firm was founded. I refilled it, smoothed a sheet of paper, and began drafting a memo titled Statement of Reconstitution and Future Mandate. The first line came easily. This firm will never again mistake age for weakness. I underlined it once, steady and sure. Then I wrote another line, and it will never forget who gave it life. Outside, a faint breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the distant hum of the city that had once ignored me, then celebrated me, then tried to bury me. I smiled at the absurd rhythm of it all. The cycle would continue, but I had broken my own part of it. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not the fragile peace of retreat, but the grounded peace of reclamation, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that stands. The days that followed unfolded in a silence so complete it felt almost reverent, like the hush after a storm when the air itself hesitates to move. The firm continued to function. Clients came and went. Cases were argued. Contracts signed. But something fundamental had shifted, an invisible realignment that rippled through every corridor and desk. The portrait that once hung crooked and half forgotten in the corner of the boardroom was restored to its proper place. I didn't ask for it, but someone, perhaps that young partner who had read the evidence aloud, had ordered it done. I returned to the office on a Tuesday morning, carrying only a single folder and my favorite pen, and walked straight to my old corner room. It had been cleaned, the desk polished, the shelves rearranged, as if they were preparing for an inspection. The smell of furniture polish and paper filled the air, a scent I had always associated with beginnings. I sat down and looked out the window. From that height, the city seemed almost tender, the streets winding like veins, the courthouse dome glinting in the distance. For years I had stared at that same skyline and thought of victory, growth, survival. Now it simply looked alive, indifferent, unjudging, real. The door opened softly behind me. It was Maya. She carried a stack of documents in a small box. "They cleared your office," she said. "I thought you might want these." Inside the box were small fragments of my professional life. The brass nameplate they had removed months ago, a fountain pen I thought I'd lost, a faded photograph of the firm's first team, 4 women, 3 men, standing in front of a rented office with peeling paint and too much hope. I ran my fingers along the edges of the photo. Time had worn it smooth. "Thank you," I said. She hesitated at the door, as if unsure whether to leave. "Everyone's been talking," she said finally. "They say you humiliated them." I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I educated them. The difference depends on who's telling the story." We discussed practicalities, the audit schedule, the reallocation of cases, the new hires. I told her I wanted the firm to recruit more women, not as decoration, but as architects. "We'll call it Alvarez and Daughters," I said. She laughed softly. "But you don't have daughters." I looked at her, the earnest defiance in her young face. "I do now," I said. When she left, the office fell quiet again. I thought of Daniel then. I hadn't heard from him since that final meeting. He had sent no letters, no calls, not even through lawyers. The absence hurt, of course it did. Motherhood doesn't dissolve in the acid of betrayal. It lingers, reshaped into something less tender, more enduring. I missed him the way one misses a home that no longer stands, with equal parts sorrow and acceptance. I kept telling myself that distance was also a kind of peace, that sometimes love means letting the silence do the talking. The papers on my desk called me back to the present. I reviewed contracts, signed memoranda, responded to emails. My movements were steady, precise, mechanical almost, but beneath them was a quiet satisfaction. I had thought victory would feel loud, triumphant, but instead it felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. In the afternoons, I took to walking down the hall, greeting staff, asking about their families, their studies, their ambitions. Some met my eyes with admiration, others with caution, but all with respect. It was enough. On Fridays, I invited the junior associates, especially the women, to my office for what I called unrecorded lessons. No slides, no performance, just stories. How to spot manipulation in polite language. How to say no without apology. How to remain calm when men mistake your silence for confusion. They listened, sometimes taking notes, sometimes just absorbing the rhythm of an old woman's voice, carrying the weight of battles they hadn't yet fought. I told them the law is only as moral as the person using it, that kindness must always be paired with clarity, and that if anyone ever tells them they are too emotional, too old, too young, too much of anything, they should remember that those words are fear disguised as authority. At home, life shrank to a gentler rhythm. I started cooking again, simple meals, lentil soup, roasted vegetables, bread from the bakery downstairs. I watered my plants, repaired a loose hinge on a window that had creaked all winter, wrote letters to friends I hadn't spoken to in years. The world outside still moved in its hurried, chaotic way, but inside I discovered a stillness that didn't feel like waiting, but like living. Some evenings, I poured a glass of wine and watched the city lights from my balcony. They shimmered in the distance, indifferent and eternal. I would think of my husband then, of how proud he would have been to see me stand unbroken, of how much he would have laughed at the absurdity of men trying to teach me law. I thought of my younger self, the woman who had walked into courtrooms trembling but unyielding, who had believed that justice was a structure that could be built. Perhaps it was, but not out of statutes and verdicts, out of endurance, memory, and refusal. One morning, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single line written in Daniel's handwriting. I understand now. No apology, no explanation, just that. I read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the box with the old photograph. It was enough, or as much as could be expected. Some bridges are not rebuilt. They are simply acknowledged as ruins and left to stand as monuments to what once was. I felt no anger anymore, only the dull ache of release. He would live his life, and I would live mine. Perhaps in some distant future, he would teach his own children not to mistake love for ownership. The following week, the firm held its annual meeting. They insisted I speak, though I no longer needed an audience. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that mirrored the full spectrum of human cowardice and courage. I told them the story of our beginning, the bakery upstairs, the borrowed desk, the seamstress who brought me bread after her first victory. I reminded them that law is not just a business, but a language of memory, and that the moment we forget the human pulse beneath the contracts, we stop being lawyers and start being clerks of greed. When I finished, the applause was soft, but sincere. I didn't need more. That night, back in my office, I poured myself a final glass of brandy and wrote the last entry in my journal. I am not a survivor. I am a witness. The words came easily, and with them, the realization that my story no longer belonged to me alone. It was part of a larger one, a quiet lineage of women who had refused to vanish. I closed the journal, turned off the light, and stood by the window. The city below pulsed with life, loud, flawed, relentless. I watched until the horizon began to lighten, the first suggestion of dawn creeping between the buildings. A new day was coming, as they always do, indifferent to who has fallen or risen. I smiled to myself, whispered into the silence, "Never let them tell you you're too old to understand." Then I sat down at my desk once more, the weight of the pen in my hand familiar and kind, ready to write whatever came next.